Humanity wants to reach another star, but generation ships reveal a terrifying truth. The journey is not just about distance. It is about whether a closed society can survive for centuries with no exit, no rescue, and no guarantee the destination is worth it. Every child born on board inherits a mission they never chose. So the real question is not how far humans can travel, but what price the future must pay. Today, we uncover the truth behind generation ships. Now, let's begin. In 2024, NASA confirmed something that should have broken the internet. Voyager 1, the most distant human-made object in existence, launched in 1977, had been flying for 47 years straight. Never stopped, never slowed down, traveling at about 35,000 miles per hour. And after all that time, after nearly 5 decades of unbroken flight through the void, it had still not left what scientists call the solar neighborhood, the gravitational and particle influence zone of our own sun. It is, in the most literal sense, barely out the front door. To reach Proxima Centauri, the single closest star to our sun at Voyager 1's current speed, would take approximately 73,000 more years. Read that again. 73,000 years. That is the problem. That is the wall every civilization eventually hits when it looks up and dares to ask, can we go there? The answer, with every engine technology we currently possess, is no, not in any time frame a human life can hold. Not in 100 lives, not in 1,000. So what do you do when the destination is real? The desire is real, but the physics of space-time simply refuse to cooperate. You rethink who does the traveling. That is where generation ships enter the conversation. And calling them ships is already a fundamental misunderstanding of what they actually are. A ship implies a vessel you board, a journey you take, and a destination you reach. A generation ship is none of that, at least not for most of the people on it. It is, more accurately, a civilization in a can, a self-contained world, launched into the dark, carrying not just passengers, but entire societies, cultures, knowledge systems, and bloodlines across time, measured not in years or decades, but in centuries. The core premise is brutal in its simplicity. The generation that boards the ship will never arrive. They will live their entire lives in transit, be born, grow up, fall in love, raise children, grow old, and die all within the same metal walls, under the same artificial light, never setting foot on the world they are heading toward. Their children will do the same, and their children's children. The generation that finally steps off the ship onto alien soil will be descended, perhaps 10 or 15 generations deep, from the people who originally launched. Think about what that actually means. The founders of the mission make a decision, an enormous civilization-scale decision, on behalf of every human being who will ever live on that ship. People who have not been born yet. People who never agreed to anything. People who will grow up knowing nothing but the inside of a metal container, hurtling through empty space, told that their entire purpose, their entire life's meaning, is to continue a journey someone else started. A useful comparison. Imagine the story of the Mayflower, the ship that carried the Pilgrims to the New World in 1620. 102 passengers, 66 days at sea, landing in a place they had read about but never seen. It was hard. People died. But 66 days is survivable. You can hold the dream of land in your mind for 66 days. Now stretch that voyage to 500 years, not 66 days. 500 years, and strip away the part where anyone on board will ever see land. The people who leave Earth will never see the destination. The people who arrive have never seen Earth. Nobody on the entire journey will ever stand on solid ground. They exist entirely in the between. At least on the Mayflower, everyone knew America existed. They had maps, they had reports, They had been told by people who had been there. On a generation ship heading toward Proxima Centauri, EE, a potentially habitable exoplanet, 4.24 light-years away. The destination is, as of right now, a dot of inferred data, a signal wobble, a statistical probability of rock within a certain temperature range. The planet these people are dying to reach may not even be what anyone hopes it is. Does that sound like a mission you would volunteer for? And yet here is where it gets philosophically strange. People probably would volunteer. Humans have always walked toward the horizon. Every ocean crossed, every continent mapped, every mountain climbed was done by people who chose suffering and uncertainty over the safety of the known. The desire to go further is not irrational. It may, in fact, be the most human impulse that exists. The founders of a generation ship would not be deluded. They would be, in a dark, clear-eyed way, heroic. They would board knowing full well they are becoming the sacrifice. They are not the explorers. They are the fuel. The generation that finally arrives gets the glory. The generation that launched gets a cold room and an early grave, somewhere between here and there, in the middle of nothing. There is something almost funny about the Mayflower comparison. Actually, those passengers at least knew England was still behind them. They could turn around if they really needed to. On a generation ship, by the time you are far enough into the journey to doubt yourself, there is no home to go back to. Earth is as unreachable as the destination. You are, in the most literal sense, committed. But before anyone builds that ship, there is a number that engineers keep running into. A number so large it causes actual career crises in the aerospace community. And it starts with something as simple as the question, how far exactly is far? Step outside on a clear morning. Feel the sun on your face, that warmth, that light. It left the surface of the sun approximately 8 minutes ago. 8 minutes. The sun is about 93 million miles away, and the light crossed that entire distance while you were probably still deciding whether to make coffee. 8 minutes feels fast. 8 minutes feels close. And that sense of closeness is the first thing that has to be destroyed before any honest conversation about interstellar travel can happen. Because 8 minutes is nothing, barely a breath. The nearest star system to our sun is Alpha Centauri, a 3-star system about 4.24 light-years away. Proxima Centauri is the smallest of those 3 stars, and the one with a potentially habitable planet in its orbit, 4.24 light-years. Write that down. Now convert it into something tangible. Light travels at approximately 6 trillion miles per year. 4.24 light-years is roughly 25 trillion miles. 25 trillion? The distance from New York to Los Angeles is about 2,800 miles. You would have to make the New York to Los Angeles drive roughly 8.9 trillion times to cover the distance between Earth and Proxima Centauri. That number means nothing to the human brain either. So try this instead. If you shrink the entire Milky Way galaxy 100,000 light-years across, home to 200 to 400 billion stars down to the size of the continental United States, the distance between Earth and Proxima Centauri would be roughly the length of your first step off the front porch. Not a mile, not a block, one step. That is how cosmically irrelevant 4.24 light-years is on the scale of just our galaxy, and we cannot even cross that first step. Now, meet the fastest object humanity has ever built, the Parker Solar Probe. Launched by NASA in 2018 to study the sun up close, it has achieved speeds of approximately 692,000 kilometers per hour, roughly 430,000 miles per hour. That is fast enough to fly from New York to Tokyo in about 37 seconds. Fast enough to circle the entire Earth in under 2 minutes. The fastest thing we have ever made. At that speed, a trip to Proxima Centauri would take approximately 6,300 years. 6,300 years. That is longer than all of recorded human history. Longer than the time between ancient Egypt and the smartphone in your pocket. The Roman Empire rose and fell in the time we would spend, at our current best speed, barely getting started on this journey. The obvious question is, why not go faster? Why not build a faster ship? And the answer involves physics that becomes brutally punishing. The moment you start pushing toward meaningful fractions of the speed of light, which is exactly what Part 3 will get into. But there is another solution people often propose before they hit those physics problems, and it is worth dismissing properly. First, what about just putting everyone to sleep? Suspended animation. Cryosleep. The idea of freezing human passengers and waking them up centuries later at the destination. It is in every science fiction film. It feels like the obvious workaround. And as of right now, in 2024, it does not exist as a viable technology for human beings, not even close. Researchers have managed to reversibly cool small organisms, tardigrades, certain nematodes into states of suspended metabolism. Some tissues and embryos can be cryopreserved, but an adult human body is an extraordinarily complex system of interdependent biological processes, and cooling a brain with its trillions of synaptic connections, its fluid-filled cavities, its exquisitely delicate cellular architecture, to temperatures low enough to halt metabolism for centuries, then reversibly warming it back to full function, has no scientifically demonstrated pathway. Ice crystal formation alone destroys cell membranes at the microscopic level. There are theoretical frameworks, but calling them almost there would be generous to the point of fiction. The European Space Agency has funded research into what they call torpor, a lighter metabolic slowdown inspired by animals that hibernate. Results so far suggest it might reduce metabolic rate in humans by around 75% for short periods of days or weeks. Useful for a Mars mission, perhaps for a 6,000-year journey to the nearest star. It does not move the needle in any meaningful way. So cryosleep is out, which means the people on the ship have to actually live the journey, which means they age, which means they die, which means their children take over, which means a generation ship is not a transport vehicle. It is a civilization being created, maintained, and evolved in real time, inside a closed system for centuries. We worry about a 15-hour flight to London. We complain about the legroom. We stress about the meal options and whether the Wi-Fi works. A generation ship is 500 years of that, except there is no landing, no airport, no check-in desk, and no way off. If the founding generation knows they will never arrive, what exactly are they signing up for? What makes a human being climb aboard something like that? The answer to that question turns out to be both more complicated and more terrifying than it looks. Because it is not just about individual choice or personal bravery. It is about the physics of what happens when you try to solve the time problem a different way by going faster. And the moment you try to go faster, the universe introduces a new category of danger that makes everything discussed so far look almost quaint. And even when they accept all of that, the speed needed to go meaningfully faster will create a completely different kind of danger. At 10% of the speed of light, a grain of sand kills you. Not metaphorically. Not as an exaggeration for effect. A particle of dust, the kind that floats in a sunbeam in your living room, the kind you would never notice stepping on traveling at a relative velocity of roughly 67 million miles per hour, carries kinetic energy equivalent to a small nuclear weapon detonating directly against the hull of your ship. One grain of sand, one moment of bad luck in the interstellar medium. Mission over, everyone dead. The vacuum of space does not give warnings. This is the speed paradox at the center of every serious conversation about interstellar travel. Going faster seems like the obvious answer to the distance problem. The further you push toward a meaningful fraction of the speed of light, the shorter the effective travel time becomes. At 10% light speed, Proxima Centauri is about 42 years away, still longer than most careers. but conceivably survivable within a single generation if you launch young enough. At 20% light speed, it drops to around 21 years. The math is encouraging. The physics is murderous. Interstellar space is not empty. That is the thing nobody pictures correctly when they imagine the void between stars. It looks empty in photographs. It feels conceptually empty when described as vacuum. But it is threaded through with gas, plasma, charged particles, and crucially dust, microscopic grains of silicate and carbon material, remnants of dead stars, scattered at densities that sound trivially low until you factor in the speeds involved. At 1% of the speed of light, a dust grain the size of a red blood cell carries roughly the same energy as a rifle bullet. Scale that up to 10 or 20%, and the energy scales with the square of the velocity. The damage potential does not grow linearly. It explodes. This is not theoretical concern. In 2016, the Breakthrough Starshot Initiative, backed by physicist Stephen Hawking and investor Yuri Milner, with genuine scientific credibility and a $100 million research budget, proposed launching a fleet of postage stamp-sized probes to Alpha Centauri at 20% of the speed of light. These probes would weigh approximately 1 gram each. 1 gram, lighter than a paperclip, and even at that near-zero mass. The project's own published research identified interstellar dust collision as one of the most serious unsolved engineering challenges of the entire concept. The proposed solution involved making the probes as thin and edge-on as possible to minimize their cross-sectional profile, essentially teaching a spacecraft to dodge by being almost two-dimensional. Now consider a generation ship. A vessel capable of sustaining thousands of human beings for centuries cannot weigh 1 gram. Conservative engineering estimates put the minimum viable mass of such a ship at around 1 million kilograms, and that is almost certainly optimistic, likely by an order of magnitude. At that mass, traveling at 10% of the speed of light, the kinetic energy of a single millimeter-sized dust particle striking the hull exceeds the energy released by the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. There is no material currently known to engineering that could absorb that impact without catastrophic structural failure. You cannot armor your way out of this problem. You cannot dodge at those speeds. Your reaction time to detected objects would be measured in microseconds, and course corrections require energy. The interstellar medium is not a highway with clear lanes. It is a minefield where the mines are invisible and moving. So speed is dangerous. Fine. What about the energy required to reach that speed in the first place? This is where the numbers stop being merely frightening and start being almost comedic in their scale. Accelerating 1 million kilograms to 10% of the speed of light requires, by straightforward relativistic physics calculations, approximately 4.5 times 10 to the 23rd joules of energy. The entire electrical output of human civilization in 2023, every power plant, every solar panel, every wind turbine on Earth running simultaneously for 1 full year, generates roughly 6.7 times 10 to the 20 joules. That means accelerating a minimum mass generation ship to 10% light speed would require roughly 670 years' worth of humanity's total current energy production, dedicated entirely to one launch, not to mention that you then need to decelerate at the other end, which requires the same energy investment all over again. No propulsion system in human hands comes close. Ion thrusters, the most fuel-efficient engines currently operating in space, produce thrust measured in millinewtons. Efficient? Yes. But moving a 1 million kilogram ship with ion thrusters is like trying to push a fully loaded USS Gerald R. Ford supercarrier 92,500 tons of warship using a pair of AA batteries. Theoretically, given enough time, the batteries do push the ship. Practically, you will have long since aged to dust before anything interesting happens. Nuclear thermal propulsion. which NASA has actively been developing under the Draco program, could potentially cut travel times to Mars significantly. But even the most optimistic projections for nuclear pulse propulsion engines that detonate nuclear bombs behind the ship in sequence. A real concept called Project Orion, studied in the 1950s and 60s, max out at roughly 3 to 5% of the speed of light? Better. Still 6,000 years to Proxima Centauri. Still not enough. Fusion propulsion remains theoretically powerful, but practically unbuilt humanity has been 20 years away from viable fusion energy for about 60 years now. Physicists have a name for the fundamental structural reason all of this is so hard. They call it the tyranny of the rocket equation. It sounds like something a Marvel villain would name their doomsday device. In reality, it is considerably more frightening, because at least Marvel villains can be punched. The rocket equation, formalized by Konstantin Tsiolkovsky in 1903, describes the brutal mathematical relationship between a rocket's mass, its exhaust velocity, and the speed change it can achieve. The problem is this: to go faster, you need more fuel. But fuel has mass, and that mass requires more fuel to accelerate, which adds more mass, which requires even more fuel. The equation spirals against you exponentially. To reach 10% of light speed using chemical propulsion, you would need a fuel-to-payload ratio so large the ship would be essentially all fuel, a tiny capsule of people strapped to an ocean of propellant. So if going fast is physically catastrophic, and going slow means dying in transit across dozens of generations, what option does that actually leave? There is only one answer the physics allows. Stop trying to get there quickly. Accept the centuries. Accept the generations. Build something that does not need to arrive in a human lifetime, because no single human lifetime is the unit of measurement anymore. Build a world instead of a vehicle. Bring the destination with you, in the form of a society capable of sustaining itself indefinitely. The answer to the tyranny of the rocket equation is to stop racing and start enduring. The answer is simple. Stop trying to go fast. Bring the whole world with you and hope that world doesn't destroy itself before it gets there. The International Space Station is the single most complex and expensive structure humanity has ever placed in orbit. It took 13 years and 37 assembly flights to build. It weighs approximately 420,000 kilograms, spans roughly the length of an American football field, and represents the cooperative engineering achievement of 15 nations. It is, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary. It sustains 6 to 7 people, and it cannot keep them alive for more than a few months without resupply missions from Earth. Every 60 to 90 days, a cargo vehicle docks with the ISS carrying food, water, spare parts, scientific equipment, and the dozens of consumables that the station cannot produce itself. Remove those resupply missions, and the station becomes a coffin in orbit within months. The crew does not starve dramatically. They run out of the quiet, invisible things first: carbon dioxide scrubber material, water recycling components, specific micronutrients that the station's limited plant experiments cannot reliably produce. The ISS is an extraordinary machine, but it is a machine entirely dependent on the civilization it orbits. Take away Earth, and it lasts weeks. A generation ship has no Earth to call, no resupply, no emergency cargo launch, no option to send up a replacement part when something critical breaks. Whatever the ship carries when it leaves is everything it will ever have, plus whatever it can manufacture, grow, recycle, and regenerate entirely from within its own closed systems for the entire duration of a journey measured in centuries. That is not a logistics challenge. It is a civilization design challenge of a fundamentally different order. The scope of what fully self-sufficient actually requires becomes clear quickly when you start listing the categories. ARR. The ship needs a system that continuously removes carbon dioxide exhaled by thousands of people and replaces it with breathable oxygen not from tanks, which would be exhausted in weeks, but from biological or chemical processes running in perpetual loop. Water every drop must be captured, filtered, sterilized, and recycled from breath moisture to urine to agricultural runoff with near-perfect efficiency across centuries. Food, no external supply chain, no imports, no variety unless grown on board. Medicine pharmaceuticals degrade over time, which means either manufacturing capabilities or botanical alternatives must be maintained. Construction materials, when something breaks and everything breaks. Given enough time, the raw materials to fix or replace it must exist somewhere on the ship. The supply of spare parts is finite. Eventually, the ship must be capable of making its own spare parts. NASA's research program on bioregenerative life support systems, conducted over several decades, most intensively through the Advanced Life Support Program, has produced concrete numbers on the agricultural requirements alone. To feed 500 people in a fully closed system with no external inputs, you need a minimum of approximately 50 hectares of crop growing area. 50 hectares. That is roughly the size of 70 American football fields of active farmland, operating continuously, producing adequate calories and nutritional balance, without a single season of crop failure that cannot be immediately compensated. This is for 500 people, the minimum viable population for genetic diversity on a generation ship. A figure we will return to later is estimated by researchers like Cameron Smith at Portland State University to be between 10,000 and 40,000 individuals. Scale the agriculture accordingly. But raw growing space is only the beginning of the ecological problem. On Earth, the systems that keep soil fertile, air clean, and water pure are almost entirely invisible to the people who depend on them. Bacteria in the soil fix nitrogen from the air and make it available to plant roots. Fungi form symbiotic networks with plant root systems and dramatically increase their ability to absorb water and minerals. Insects pollinate crops and decompose dead organic matter. Larger organisms control insect populations. Decomposer communities, bacteria, fungi, worms break down dead biological material and return its nutrients to the soil. The entire planetary nutrient cycle is maintained by trillions of organisms doing specific jobs, shaped by billions of years of coevolution, operating at scales from the microscopic to the continental. On a generation ship, every single one of those loops must be consciously engineered, maintained, and kept in balance. Every nitrogen cycle, every carbon cycle, every phosphorus exchange. The moment any critical link breaks, a bacterial population collapses. A fungal network fails. A pollinator species dies out. The cascade effects can unravel the entire agricultural system. Earth can absorb those shocks because it has redundancy built into its vast scale. A ship cannot absorb them because there is no redundancy. Every ecological function must be replaced by a backup system that itself requires maintenance and has its own failure modes. The most instructive real-world test of this principle ran in the Arizona desert between 1991 and 1993. Biosphere 2 was a 3-acre sealed glass and steel structure, the largest closed ecological experiment ever attempted, designed to be completely self-sustaining for its 8 resident scientists over a 2-year mission. The budget was $200 million. The team were carefully selected experts in ecology, medicine, agriculture, and systems management. The technology was the best available. The preparation took years. It failed within 16 months, not catastrophically, and all at once gradually, in the way that closed systems fail when their designers underestimate complexity. Oxygen levels in the habitat dropped from 21% normal atmospheric concentration to 14.2%. That is roughly equivalent to standing at 12,500 feet elevation. The crew experienced chronic fatigue, cognitive impairment, and difficulty breathing. Cockroach and ant populations exploded, while vertebrate species and pollinating insects collapsed. Crop yields fell far below projections. Morning glory vines, introduced as a food crop, aggressively overwhelmed other species. Concrete in the structure absorbed carbon dioxide, altering the atmosphere in ways the designers had not anticipated. After 16 months, the project managers made the call to pump in oxygen from outside. The seal was broken. 8 scientists, $200 million, 3 acres, 16 months, and they still had to call for help. A generation ship is not 3 acres. It is thousands of people. It is 500 years, and there is no phone number to call. If keeping 500 people alive in a closed system proved nearly impossible after just 2 years, what happens when that same system has to run for 5 centuries without stopping, without outside help, and without a single critical failure it cannot recover from on its own? The answer to that question is, without exaggeration, the most technically demanding problem in the history of engineering, and it does not even touch the hardest part. Because the hardest part is not the machines, not the ecology, not the energy systems. The scariest thing in the whole journey is not an asteroid, not radiation, not a broken reactor. It is time itself. And what time does to the one system on the ship that no engineer has ever figured out how to maintain. The average commercial aircraft, a Boeing 747, an Airbus A380, a machine maintained by teams of certified engineers after every single flight, inspected at regular intervals, grounded the moment any system shows abnormal readings, serviced in hangars equipped with the full industrial might of 21st century aerospace technology, has a working lifespan of roughly 25 to 30 years. After that, the cost of keeping it airworthy exceeds its operational value. It gets retired, scrapped, replaced by something newer. A generation ship needs to operate for 500 years. That is not 25 years, not 30. 500, approximately 20 times the lifespan of the most carefully maintained flying machine humanity currently produces, in an environment infinitely more hostile than Earth's atmosphere, with zero access to external repair facilities, zero replacement parts that cannot be manufactured on board, and zero option to simply land the thing and call a technician. That gap between what our best engineering produces and what a generation ship demands is not a gap that gets bridged by working harder or spending more money. It is a categorical difference in what reliable means. On Earth, reliability is managed through redundancy, regular replacement, and the ultimate backstop of a planetary industrial civilization that can manufacture any part you need. In deep interstellar space, 300 years from both your origin and your destination, none of those backstops exist. The ship is entirely alone. When something breaks, and given enough time, everything breaks. The only resources available are what the ship already carries and what the people on board already know how to do. This is the single point of failure problem, and it does not just apply to one component. It applies to the entire vessel simultaneously. On the International Space Station, the redundancy philosophy is well established if a critical system fails. The crew has options. The Soyuz capsule docked at the station serves as a permanent lifeboat, capable of returning the crew to Earth within roughly 3 hours of an emergency evacuation decision. When the station's oxygen generation system has malfunctioned, which it has, multiple times mission controllers in Houston and Moscow work the problem from the ground, while crew members execute workarounds from checklists developed in advance. The entire weight of Earth's aerospace industry stands behind every anomaly response. Problems get solved because the resources to solve them are effectively unlimited. On a generation ship, 300 years into the journey, there is no lifeboat. There is nowhere to evacuate to. Mission control does not exist, or if it does, The radio signal takes decades to arrive and decades more to receive a response. Every anomaly must be solved by the people on the ship, using the tools and knowledge the ship carries, with no outside consultation and no second chances on critical systems. The air system fails. You fix it or you suffocate. The water recycling breaks down. You fix it or you die of thirst. The agricultural lights malfunction. You fix it or the crops fail and starvation follows. There are no other options in the menu. Now consider the actual lifespan of the components those systems depend on. Semiconductor chips. The logic boards that control virtually every automated system on a modern vessel have operational lifespans typically measured in decades under ideal conditions. Vibration, radiation, and thermal cycling accelerate degradation significantly. In the interstellar radiation environment, unshielded electronics face constant bombardment by cosmic rays and high-energy particles that cause cumulative damage at the molecular level, flipping bits in memory, degrading transistor junctions, introducing subtle errors that compound over time. Bearings, the rolling steel components inside every motor, every pump, every rotating assembly on the ship, have typical design lifespans of tens of thousands of hours of operation. At continuous use, that translates to years, not centuries. Hydraulic pumps, valve seals, pressure vessels, heat exchangers, every mechanical component has a wear curve, an end-of-life point, a moment when metal fatigue or material degradation crosses a threshold and the component fails. Even the structure of the ship itself is not exempt. Standard reinforced concrete, the most common construction material in human civilization, has a rated structural lifespan of 50 to 100 years under normal conditions. Steel corrodes. Polymers break down under ultraviolet and radiation exposure. The adhesives, sealants, and gaskets that keep pressurized compartments airtight are organic compounds that degrade over decades. A ship built to last 500 years cannot be built from the materials we currently use as standard. Every material choice has to be rethought from the ground up, tested against timescales that no terrestrial engineering project has ever needed to consider. But material degradation, as serious as it is, may not be the deepest problem. The deeper problem is what happens to the knowledge required to fix things, as that knowledge passes from one generation of people to the next across 2 or 3 centuries. Call it the entropy of civilization, the tendency of complex technical knowledge to degrade, simplify, and eventually disappear when the community that holds it shrinks, becomes isolated, and faces competing demands on its attention and memory. Every repair procedure, every manufacturing process, every diagnostic protocol on a generation ship must be learned by each new generation of crew members. Not just the broad strokes, the actual hands-on, muscle memory, judgment-based skill of knowing what a healthy pump sounds like versus one about to fail, or recognizing the early signs of a microbial imbalance in the atmospheric system before it becomes a crisis. That knowledge lives in people, not just in manuals. And people die. Each generational handoff is a moment where some fraction of the working knowledge of the ship can be lost, simplified, misremembered, recorded incompletely, or simply never taught because the previous generation ran out of time. The analogy is uncomfortably direct. Imagine needing your 15th generation descendant to know how to rebuild the engine of your current car from raw materials. Not read about it, not look it up. Actually do it with their hands, under pressure, when it breaks at 3 a.m. and people are depending on them. No internet to search, no YouTube repair videos, no trade school, no manufacturer's hotline. Just whatever knowledge survived 15 rounds of imperfect human transmission, written in manuals that may themselves have degraded, describing tools that may no longer exist in their original form. This is not a hypothetical. The knowledge required to produce Roman concrete opus cementitium, a material so durable that structures built 2,000 years ago still stand, while modern concrete crumbles after decades was lost entirely after the fall of Rome and only partially reconstructed by researchers publishing in 2023. The knowledge existed. Civilizations are not careful with knowledge. They lose it constantly. And on Earth, losing knowledge is merely a setback. On a generation ship, losing the knowledge of how to maintain a critical system is a death sentence delivered in slow motion. Apple releases a new iPhone every 12 months and officially drops software support for older models after approximately 5 years. The hardware is considered obsolete in E6. Entire engineering teams exist solely to deprecate the old and build the new. Because that is how technological civilization on Earth functions, through constant replacement, not through maintenance. Nobody designs for 500 years because nobody on Earth has ever needed to. So the honest question becomes, who exactly maintains the operating system of a generation ship in the year 2347? 221 years after everyone who originally wrote it is dead. Do you actually believe that 500 years from now, your descendants will still know how to fix what you built today? Think carefully before answering, because on a generation ship, the answer to that question is not academic. It is the difference between arrival and extinction. The mechanical systems can be over-engineered, materials science can advance, redundancy can be layered upon redundancy. With automated repair systems and self-healing materials and AI maintenance protocols, all of that is theoretically possible to improve. Engineers can be pushed to design better. But there is one system on that ship that no engineer has ever successfully redesigned the human being. And that is where the story becomes truly terrifying. In the entire documented history of long-duration space missions, the leading cause of mission failure, mission abort, and near-catastrophic incident is not mechanical breakdown. It is not radiation. It is not micrometeorite impact or orbital miscalculation. According to records compiled by NASA and reviewed across decades of crewed spaceflight from early Apollo missions through Skylab, MAR, and the International Space Station, the factor that most consistently threatens mission success is the human being. Internal conflict, operational error, psychological deterioration, the slow unraveling of group cohesion under stress and confinement. The most sophisticated machinery ever built, rendered dangerous or useless by the people operating it. This is not a comfortable truth. It is also not debatable. In 1973, the crew of Skylab 4-3 astronauts on an 84-day mission staged what NASA historians have called the first strike in space, exhausted, overworked, and feeling micromanaged from the ground. The crew unilaterally took a day off, turned off their radio, and refused to communicate with mission control for 24 hours. The mission continued, but the psychological rupture between ground and crew was never fully repaired. That was 84 days. Now extrapolate to 500 years and 10,000 people with no mission control to negotiate with, no ground to appeal to, and no end date visible on any horizon. The most rigorous modern research into this problem comes from the HISEAS program, Hawaii Space Exploration Analog and Simulation, a NASA-funded project that placed small crews of carefully screened candidates in a remote, isolated habitat on the slopes of Mauna Loa in Hawaii, simulating the psychological conditions of a long-duration Mars mission. These were not random volunteers. They were scientists, engineers, and professionals selected through exhaustive psychological evaluation, chosen specifically for emotional stability, conflict resolution skills, and the demonstrated ability to function under pressure. The missions lasted between 4 months and 1 year. In every single mission, researchers documented the same patterns: interpersonal conflict escalating over time, subgroup formation and social fracturing, declining motivation in the mission's middle phases, and significant symptoms of depression and anxiety that standard pre-screening had not predicted. One mission saw communication between crew members break down so severely that some individuals stopped speaking to others entirely. Working in the same small habitat, eating at the same table, and maintaining weeks of deliberate silence. These were the best candidates available, screened harder than almost any professional selection process on Earth. And still, within months, the group dynamics deteriorated in measurable, documented ways. Now consider the genetic dimension of the problem, because it adds a layer of constraint that has nothing to do with psychology and everything to do with biology. A small founding population on a generation ship does not just face social challenges, it faces genetic ones: inbreeding depression, the gradual accumulation of harmful recessive mutations, the loss of genetic diversity that, over generations, narrows the population's biological resilience to disease, environmental stress, and developmental variation. Cameron Smith, a biological anthropologist at Portland State University, has published research calculating the minimum founding population required for a generation ship to maintain genetic health across a multi-century voyage. His figures between 10,000 and 40,000 individuals at minimum. Below 10,000, genetic diversity begins declining toward dangerous territory within a few generations, regardless of how carefully reproduction is managed. 10,000 people, that is the floor, not the ideal, the floor. The engineering implications of that number are staggering. A ship designed to house, feed, provide breathable air for, supply fresh water to, and maintain the physical and psychological health of 10,000 human beings across 500 years is not a vehicle in any conventional sense. It is a city, a self-contained metropolitan area launched into the void, with all the infrastructure, governance complexity, resource management, and social volatility that any city of 10,000 people generates, except with no surrounding region to draw resources from, no neighboring city to trade with, no national government to appeal to, and no escape valve for people who want to leave. The paradox is brutal and perfectly closed. Fewer people means the mission is biologically doomed. The gene pool narrows. Diversity collapses. The population becomes increasingly fragile over generations. More people means the ship must be exponentially larger, heavier, and more energy intensive to launch and sustain, which pushes the engineering requirements further beyond anything currently conceivable, which makes the mission harder to fund, harder to build, and harder to launch. There is no comfortable middle ground. Every number you pick is wrong in a different direction. Think of it this way. Imagine founding a completely isolated town, no roads in or out, no internet connection to the outside world, no immigration, no emigration, no external trade, no outside political authority. The town starts with 10,000 residents. Nobody leaves, nobody new arrives. For 500 years, whatever social structures, economic systems, cultural norms, and power dynamics develop inside that town are entirely self-contained. Every conflict must be resolved internally. Every resource crisis managed with what exists inside the perimeter. Every generation of children inherits whatever the previous generation built or destroyed. Researchers actually use the term minimum viable population for the 10,000 figure. Spoken aloud in a scientific paper, it sounds clinical and precise. What it actually describes is the minimum number of human beings you need to trap in a metal container for half a millennium before their descendants start arriving biologically intact at the other end. That is the technical definition of viable. It sounds less like an engineering parameter and more like the terms and conditions of an interstellar dating app that nobody read before clicking agree. Do you think 10,000 people living together for 500 years with no way out would stay cooperative or tear each other apart first? History does not offer much comfort on that question. Every isolated community in the historical record, from island settlements to remote colonial outposts, to religious communes, has eventually fractured, radicalized, stratified into rigid hierarchies, or collapsed into violence. The question for a generation ship is not whether those forces will appear. They will. The question is whether the social architecture of the ship can survive them when they do without courts of appeal, without outside intervention, and without the option that has resolved most human conflicts throughout history leaving. And even if they never kill each other, the environment of the ship is, every day and every hour, attacking the most fragile thing a human being possesses, the mind. Researchers studying solitary confinement in prison systems have documented something that should fundamentally change how we think about confined environments. After just 15 days in isolation, not years, not months, 15 days, the human brain begins showing measurable neurological damage. Not distress, not discomfort, structural and functional changes detectable through neuroimaging. Reduced activity in regions governing emotional regulation, early-stage perceptual disturbances, anxiety responses that persist after confinement ends. 15 days. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture has classified prolonged solitary confinement as a form of torture precisely because of this timeline, because the damage begins before most people even stop expecting rescue. A generation ship is not solitary confinement. Nobody is alone. Nobody is locked in a small cell. But it shares the essential feature that makes solitary confinement so destructive: the permanent, inescapable absence of a natural environment. No sunlight that comes from an actual star. No wind. No rain. No soil under bare feet. No horizon that extends beyond a wall. No sky. Just corridors, chambers, grow lights, recycled air, and the same faces, the same sounds, the same metal surfaces day after day, year after year, decade after decade, for an entire human lifetime. You are not in prison on a generation ship. You simply cannot leave. The distinction matters legally. It does not matter psychologically. Environmental psychologists use the term solastalgia to describe the grief people experience when their home environment is damaged or destroyed. The distress of a farmer watching drought kill their land, or a coastal community watching the sea consume their neighborhood. It is the pain of environmental loss. On a generation ship, the concept inverts into something with no existing name. The people born on the ship have never had a natural environment to lose. They have never seen an actual sky. They have never smelled rain on dry earth, or felt unfiltered sunlight on their skin, or stood somewhere that extended beyond the range of their vision. They do not experience solastalgia because there is no lost environment to grieve. They experience something potentially worse: a complete absence of the environmental baseline that human neurology evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to expect and require. The human nervous system did not develop in metal corridors. It developed in forests, on plains, near rivers and coastlines, under open skies that changed color with the hour and the season. The entire architecture of human sensory experience, the particular wavelengths of light that signal safety and calm, the smells associated with safety and threat, the spatial sense of open versus enclosed, is calibrated to a natural world that a generation ship cannot provide. Research in environmental psychology consistently shows that access to natural environments reduces cortisol levels, lowers blood pressure, improves cognitive function, and reduces symptoms of depression and anxiety. Remove that access permanently, and you are not simply removing a preference. You are removing something the brain treats as a biological necessity. The closest real-world data comes from research stations in Antarctica. The Mirny Station, operated by Russia on the Antarctic coast, keeps a small team of researchers through the polar winter, 8 to 9 months of isolation, extreme cold, and in the winter months, complete darkness. Studies of winter over personnel at Antarctic stations have documented depression rates approaching 60% during the isolation period, along with cognitive dulling, irritability, social withdrawal, and what researchers call the winter over syndrome, a cluster of psychological symptoms that appear reliably even in carefully selected, well-supported, professionally motivated individuals. And these people, every single one of them, know that the winter ends. They know the supply plane arrives on a specific date. They know that within months, they will stand in sunlight again, board a flight, and return to everything familiar. That knowledge, the guaranteed endpoint, is itself a powerful psychological anchor that keeps deterioration from becoming irreversible. On a generation ship, there is no supply plane, no scheduled end to the isolation, no date on the calendar that represents return to anything. For the founding generation, there is the memory of Earth, a thing they left behind, receding at whatever fraction of light speed the ship manages, becoming first a blue dot, then a point of light, then nothing distinguishable from any other star. For every generation after the first, there is not even that. They are born into the ship. They grow up in the ship. They will die in the ship. The ship is not where they are temporarily. It is the entirety of the world that has ever existed for them. This creates a philosophical question that is genuinely difficult to resolve. A child born on the ship knows only the ship, the corridors, the grow bays, the observation ports showing stars that never seem to move, the faces of the same community cycling through the same spaces. Is that child traumatized by an absence they have never known? Or have they simply adapted, built a neurology calibrated to artificial light and recycled air and enclosed space, the way any organism adapts to the environment it grows up in? Imagine growing up and never knowing what an actual sky looks like, not as deprivation, just as the simple fact of your world. You have seen photographs in historical archives. You know intellectually that something called a horizon exists, that water falls from clouds, that there is a star close enough to feel warm on skin. But no one can take you outside to check. The knowledge is entirely abstract, entirely inherited, and entirely unverifiable within your lifetime. Whether that constitutes freedom or the most comprehensive form of cognitive confinement in human history is a question philosophers have begun taking seriously, and it does not have a clean answer. Psychologists advising on generation ship design proposals have, with total seriousness, recommended incorporating virtual reality windows throughout the ship, large-scale immersive displays simulating forests, coastlines, open skies, weather patterns, the feel of wind and rain recreated through environmental control systems. The goal is to provide the neurological inputs the human brain requires, artificially, because the real thing is unavailable, formalized, pre-planned psychological maintenance for an entire civilization, budgeted and engineered before the ship ever launches. Civilization-scale therapy, designed into the architecture from day one, because the designers know with certainty that without it, the population will deteriorate. If you were born into a world with no blue sky, no wind, no rain, do you honestly think you would be fine? Take a moment with that. Because the people who designed these proposals did, and the answer they arrived at was probably not, without serious intervention. And intervention costs resources, requires ongoing maintenance, and depends on the social stability of a population that is simultaneously managing every other catastrophic challenge discussed so far. The individual psychology is terrifying enough on its own, but a ship carrying 10,000 people does not just have individual psychologies. It has a collective one. It has politics, hierarchies, ideological divisions, generational resentments, and the accumulated weight of centuries of shared confinement. And that collective psychology needs to be governed by some structure of authority and rule that can hold together across 500 years and 20 generations without collapsing into tyranny or chaos. But psychological pressure on individuals is only half the problem. What is far more frightening is what happens when 10,000 of those people start organizing into a society, and that society needs someone to control it. No government on Earth has survived 500 years intact. Not one. The United States, the world's oldest continuously functioning constitutional democracy, is 249 years old, has fought a civil war that nearly destroyed it, and has amended its founding document 27 times. The British Parliament traces its roots to the 13th century, but has been restructured, suspended, and fundamentally transformed so many times across those centuries that calling it the same institution is largely a matter of convenient historical narrative. The Roman Empire, often cited as history's great example of political longevity, technically split, transformed into the Byzantine Empire, absorbed Christianity as a state religion, and collapsed in the West after roughly 500 years, precisely the duration of a generation ship voyage. Every empire, every dynasty, every republic that has ever claimed permanence has eventually broken under the weight of time, internal contradiction, and the stubborn refusal of subsequent generations to feel bound by what their ancestors decided. This is not cynicism. It is the most consistent pattern in the entire recorded history of human political organization. Governments do not last 500 years. Systems of rule corrode. Legitimacy erodes. People change their minds about who has the right to tell them what to do. And on Earth, when that happens, there are mechanisms, however painful and messy, for the system to reset. Revolutions, elections, coups, constitutional crises resolved over decades. The system tears and is restitched into something different. Life goes on. On a generation ship, the stakes of political failure are not a new administration or a reorganized parliament. They are everyone dying. The legitimacy problem appears immediately once you move past the founding generation. The people who chose to board the ship, who signed whatever agreements, took whatever oaths, understood whatever mission parameters existed at launch, made a voluntary choice. That choice is theirs. It belongs to them. The question that no political theorist has cleanly resolved is what authority that choice exercises over the children those people have on board, or the grandchildren, or the generation born 150 years into the voyage who have never seen Earth, never met anyone who saw Earth, and never agreed to any of this. By what principle of governance does the dead hand of the founding generation command the living? What makes the constitutional document written before launch binding on someone born 2 centuries after it was drafted, in a society they cannot leave, pursuing a destination they did not choose? Legal scholars who have examined the governance questions around generation ships, including academics publishing in journals of space law and international law, have concluded something remarkable. A generation ship in interstellar space exists in a condition of complete legal vacuum. No nation-state retains jurisdiction beyond a certain distance. No international treaty currently governs conduct in interstellar space. No court could enforce a ruling. No external authority could intervene in any internal situation regardless of severity. The ship is, from the moment it passes beyond the reach of any plausible enforcement mechanism, entirely its own legal universe. Whatever law exists on that ship is whatever the people on that ship decide, or whatever the people with the most power decide for everyone else. Political philosophers and space mission designers have proposed several governance models for exactly this problem, and each one carries the seeds of its own failure. A military command structure, strict hierarchy, chain of command, mission discipline enforced from the top solves the coordination problem efficiently, but concentrates power dangerously. Military hierarchies work over months and years, over centuries, with no external threat requiring unified response and no outside authority checking the commanders. They calcify into hereditary aristocracy or outright despotism. A technocracy rule by qualified experts. The engineers and doctors and agricultural scientists who actually keep the ship alive has a certain functional logic. The people who understand the systems should arguably govern the systems. But technocracy assumes technical competence translates to political wisdom, which history repeatedly contradicts. And it creates a permanent underclass of non-specialists whose political voice is structurally zero. A rotating council model distributes power more broadly, but introduces coordination costs and the ever-present risk of factional deadlock at precisely the moment when a decisive response to a crisis is needed. A theocratic model governance grounded in shared religious belief provides the deepest possible source of legitimacy and social cohesion, but hands the apparatus of power to whoever controls doctrinal interpretation, which is an invitation to exactly the kind of manipulation that has ended badly every time it has been tried at scale. History's most instructive case study in isolated community governance is small enough to be almost absurd and exactly precise enough to be genuinely alarming. Pitcairn Island, in the South Pacific, was settled in 1790 by the mutineers from HMS Bounty and their Tahitian companions, a group of roughly 25 people who deliberately chose isolation, destroyed their ship to prevent escape, and founded a community that had no contact with the outside world for nearly 20 years. Within a decade, most of the adult men had killed each other in power struggles. By the time a passing ship made contact in 1808, only one of the original male mutineers was still alive. The community that descended from those survivors, now numbering approximately 35 people, has faced governance crises, criminal prosecutions, and questions of legitimate authority that have required intervention from the government of New Zealand and the British Crown well into the 21st century. 35 people, one island, 2 centuries, still ungovernable without outside help. A generation ship carries 10,000 people, is completely beyond the reach of any outside authority, and must govern itself for 500 years. Pitcairn Island has 35 residents and still requires outside intervention to function. A generation ship has 10,000. Best of luck. What system of government would you design to survive 500 years democracy, autocracy, or something that doesn't have a name yet? There is no clean answer, which is precisely why serious academic literature on the subject keeps returning to the same uncomfortable conclusion. Any governance system rigid enough to maintain order across 500 years will likely become oppressive, and any system flexible enough to remain legitimate across 500 years may lack the stability to survive its own internal contradictions. The tension between those two failure modes does not resolve neatly. It just sits there in every design document, waiting. And regardless of whatever system gets chosen, there will be another force on that ship. One that appears in no engineering blueprint, that holds more real power over human behavior than any government ever built faith. In every isolated long-term community in recorded history, without a single exception, religion or an equivalent system of belief has either been brought along and transformed, or has emerged spontaneously from within the group. The wagon trains crossing the American plains in the 19th century carried their denominations with them and held services in the dirt regardless of weather or danger. Prisoners of war in the most brutal camp conditions of the 20th century organized religious observance within weeks of capture, improvising rituals from almost nothing. The crew of the USS Indianapolis, adrift in shark-infested Pacific waters for 4 days after their ship was sunk in 1945, reported a sharp intensification of prayer and collective spiritual practice in the hours and days before rescue. Even in secular, scientifically oriented groups placed in extreme isolation during research studies, investigators have documented the spontaneous development of ritual, superstition, and quasi-religious meaning-making behavior. Human beings, when pushed against the edge of endurance, do not become more rational. They reach for something larger than the immediate terror. This is not a weakness. It is, in the most functional sense, a survival mechanism. On a generation ship, suffering is not an occasional visitor. It is the permanent condition of existence, the physical confinement, the psychological pressure of a sky that never changes, the knowledge unavoidable, inherited, inescapable that you were born into a mission you did not choose, will spend your entire life in service of it, and will die without knowing whether it succeeds. That is an enormous weight to carry through a human lifetime. The question is not whether the people on the ship will seek meaning for that suffering. They will, absolutely and inevitably. The question is what form that meaning-making will take after 300 years of transformation in an environment unlike anything religion has ever evolved to address before. Real-world data from high-stress isolated environments supports the basic pattern. Surveys of astronauts on long-duration ISS missions and submariners on extended deployments consistently report increased engagement with personal spiritual practices during the isolation period, more prayer, more meditation, more engagement with whatever framework of meaning the individual brought aboard. NASA psychologists have documented this as a positive coping mechanism in most cases, one that supports rather than undermines mission performance. Faith in the right configuration keeps people functional when the rational case for optimism is thin. The problem is configuration. On a generation ship, the original faith traditions carried aboard at launch will not remain static across 20 generations in a sealed environment. Religious belief always evolves, adapts to local conditions, incorporates new symbolic material from the environment, responds to the authority structures and power conflicts of the community that holds it. On Earth, that evolution happens in contact with other traditions, external critique, the pressures of pluralistic societies, and the moderating influence of institutions that have existed long enough to develop internal checks. On the ship, the evolution happens in a closed loop. Whatever direction the belief system drifts toward greater rigidity, toward apocalypticism, toward the elevation of specific technical functions into sacred roles, there is no outside force to push back. The theological environment is as sealed as the ecological one. Power and religion have been inseparable companions throughout human history, and there is no mechanism on a generation ship that prevents that relationship from developing in its most dangerous configurations. Whoever controls doctrinal interpretation controls the most fundamental source of social legitimacy on the ship. The answer to the question of why any of this matters, why suffering is acceptable, why the mission must continue, that is enormous power. And in an environment where political authority is already fragile and contested, the temptation to merge religious authority with political control is not merely theoretical. It is historically near universal in isolated communities with sufficient stress and sufficient duration. The specific scenario that keeps generation ship theorists awake is not abstract. Imagine a religious movement that emerges in, say, the 7th generation, roughly 175 years into the voyage. The original mission documents are now distant historical artifacts, written by people as remote in cultural memory as the Founding Fathers feel to a 21st century American teenager. The new belief system has incorporated the ship's systems into its theology, the engines as sacred mechanisms, the destination star as divine calling, or perhaps the opposite Earth as paradise lost, the voyage as punishment, the destination as false promise. This movement grows. It recruits among the technically trained the engineers, the atmospheric technicians, the agricultural specialists. It does not need to control the weapons, because on a ship, controlling the life support is controlling the weapons. And then, in a moment of theological conclusion, the leadership decides that God's will is to turn the ship around. The historical precedent that most precisely captures the danger is not a space mission. It is Jonestown. In November of 1978, 918 people died in Guyana following the directives of a single charismatic religious leader who had, over years of incremental escalation, constructed a community with no meaningful exit and no outside accountability. The People's Temple was isolated by design, geographically remote, socially closed, economically controlled. When the FBI and congressional investigators arrived, it was already too late. The intervention came from outside. It ended the crisis. On a generation ship, there is no FBI, no congressional delegation, no external authority arriving to break the seal. Whatever happens inside stays inside permanently. Generation ship designers working in serious academic contexts, not science fiction writers, actual engineers and mission planners have genuinely grappled with whether founding documents should include explicit prohibitions on the formation of exclusive ideological movements. One published framework from the space colonization literature refers, in careful academic language, to provisions preventing the emergence of closed doctrinal systems with exclusive claims on mission authority, translated from the scholarly A No-Cult clause, in a document meant to govern the launch of a real starship. That is not speculative fiction. That is a sentence someone actually wrote in a design document, because the problem is real enough to require a contractual answer. After 300 years of isolation in the dark between stars, what do you think religion on that ship becomes? Whatever the answer, it will be something no one on Earth today would recognize as what was originally brought aboard. It will have been shaped by centuries of confinement, by the particular politics and tragedies and heroisms of the voyage, by the specific pressures of that environment, acting on human meaning-making across generations. It may be beautiful, it may be terrifying, it will almost certainly be both. But faith, however, it transforms. However stabilizing or destabilizing it becomes, cannot answer one question that the ship's biology poses with absolute, unarguable hardness. A question that involves no theology, no politics, no governance theory, just numbers and bodies and the coldest kind of necessity. Faith can keep people alive, but it cannot solve the one biological problem that is harder than anything else on the ship who is allowed to have children. How many? And exactly when? The mathematics of population growth is indifferent to human feelings. And on a generation ship, it becomes an existential constraint with no comfortable resolution. Start with a founding population of 10,000 people. Apply a growth rate of 1% per year, modest by any historical standard, roughly half the global average growth rate of the 20th century, well below what naturally occurs in young, healthy communities with strong social cohesion and no access to family planning infrastructure. After 500 years at that rate, the population does not double, it does not triple, it multiplies by approximately 145. 10,000 people become 1,450,000. The agricultural systems designed for 10,000 people do not scale to feed 1,450,000. The oxygen generation capacity does not expand. The water recycling throughput does not increase. The living space does not grow. The ship is a fixed volume with fixed resources and a mathematics problem that compounds silently, year after year, until the numbers become physically impossible to sustain. That is one failure mode. The other runs in the opposite direction and is equally lethal, just slower and quieter. History offers several documented cases of small isolated communities whose birth rates fell below replacement level, sometimes through disease, sometimes through social disruption, sometimes simply because the conditions of life became hostile enough that people stopped having children at the rate required to maintain the population. The Shaker religious communities in 19th century America are the most complete example, a thriving network of settlements that at peak housed roughly 6,000 members, but whose religious prohibition on sexual relations and reliance entirely on conversion and adoption for growth meant that when outside recruitment dried up, the population collapsed across a few generations. By the early 21st century, fewer than 10 Shakers remained alive worldwide. A closed community that loses its replacement rate does not recover gradually. It falls off a demographic cliff, and the fall accelerates as the shrinking population has fewer young people to do the essential work, which increases the burden on those who remain, which further suppresses birth rates, which shrinks the population further. The spiral is self-reinforcing and, past a certain threshold, irreversible. On a generation ship. Demographic collapse does not mean a religious tradition fading gracefully into history. It means the engineering workforce falls below the minimum required to maintain critical systems. It means agricultural labor becomes insufficient to sustain food production. It means the accumulated knowledge base, the technical skills distributed across a working population, begins to develop dangerous gaps as the specialists who hold specific knowledge die without having trained adequate replacements. The ship begins to fail, not with a dramatic catastrophe, but with a slow institutional hollowing out, systems degrading one by one as the human capacity to maintain them quietly disappears. So the population cannot grow too fast. It cannot shrink too slow. It must remain within a functional band large enough to operate the ship, diverse enough to maintain genetic health, small enough to live within the resource constraints of a closed system, and it must hold that band voluntarily, consistently, across 500 years and 20 generations of people who each have their own desires, their own beliefs about family and children, their own responses to the particular conditions of their moment in the voyage. This is what population scientists working on generation ship viability have called the Goldilocks problem of demographic management. Not too many, not too few, sustained without coercion, maintained without collapse, preserved across a time span that no voluntary social agreement in human history has ever managed to hold. The historical record on coercive population management is unambiguous and ugly. China's one-child policy, implemented in 1979 and maintained for 35 years, produced its intended demographic effect while simultaneously generating forced sterilizations, widespread infanticide of female infants, a severe gender imbalance that still distorts Chinese society today, and deep psychological trauma across the generations who lived under it, and that was implemented by one of the most powerful state apparatuses in human history, with the full force of government surveillance and enforcement behind it, in a country where dissidents had nowhere to flee, but still found ways to resist, evade, and suffer. Nicolae Ceausescu's Romania pursued the opposite extreme, a pronatalist policy that banned contraception and abortion, mandated pregnancy monitoring, and turned reproduction into a state function. The result was hundreds of thousands of children born into conditions their families could not support, a generation of institutionalized orphans whose psychological damage became visible to the world only after the regime's collapse in 1989. Both experiments opposite in direction, identical in their willingness to subordinate reproductive autonomy to state interest, ended in documented catastrophe, and both existed on Earth, where people could eventually overthrow the policy, flee across borders, or outlast the government that imposed it. On a generation ship, there are no borders to cross, no government to outlast, no external human rights organization to document abuses and apply international pressure. Whatever reproductive management system exists on the ship is the only system that exists, enforceable by the only authority that exists in an environment from which there is no escape. The conditions for abuse are not merely present, they are structurally maximized. Then add the genetic dimension, which makes the entire problem considerably worse. As established in the research of Cameron Smith and others working on generation ship population biology, maintaining adequate genetic diversity across a multi-century voyage requires not just controlling the total number of births, but also influencing the genetic pairings that produce those births. A population of 10,000 people with random mating will still experience genetic drift, the gradual loss of rare alleles through chance over enough generations. Managing that drift requires either a very large population with genuinely random mating, or active intervention in who reproduces with whom to ensure that genetic variants are preserved across generations. The technical term for this kind of intervention, used without apparent irony in the academic literature on the subject, is assisted reproductive management. The implication is a system, whether algorithmic, institutional, or social, that tracks the genetic profiles of the ship's population and either recommends or mandates specific reproductive pairings to maintain diversity targets. No society in human history has successfully implemented directed mating programs without generating violent resistance, profound social trauma, and the most visceral kind of political opposition that human beings are capable of producing. Eugenics programs in the early 20th century, from forced sterilization in the United States upheld by the Supreme Court in Buck versus Bell in 1927, with roughly 60,000 Americans forcibly sterilized before the practice faded to the systematic programs of Nazi Germany, represent what happens when genetic management meets state power without ethical constraint. The scientific case for maintaining genetic diversity on a generation ship is legitimate and important. The mechanism required to achieve it instrumentalizes human reproduction in ways that every major ethical framework identifies as a profound violation of human dignity. These two facts do not reconcile neatly. They just sit in permanent, uncomfortable tension at the center of every serious generation ship design proposal. Scientists and mission designers refer to all of this with the phrase assisted reproductive management. The people actually living under it, watching a council of geneticists review their compatibility scores, receiving recommendations about who they should or should not have children with, being told their allotment of permitted births based on resource projections for the current decade would almost certainly have other names for it, names considerably less polite than anything that appears in a peer-reviewed journal. Would you accept a genetics council deciding how many children you are allowed to have? Sit with that question honestly, because the people who will live on a generation ship will not be asked it as a hypothetical. It will be the operational reality of their lives. Framed, however, the governing authority of that generation has chosen to frame it as civic responsibility, as scientific necessity, as religious obligation, as simple survival arithmetic. The framing changes. The underlying constraint does not. Managing the number of people on the ship is, at its core, a solvable engineering problem brutal in its social implications, but bounded by known mathematics and resource inventories. What is considerably less manageable is what happens to those people's minds as the centuries accumulate, because all those carefully counted, genetically tracked, resource-allocated children will grow up needing to know something. They will need to know how to keep the ship alive, and the system responsible for making sure that knowledge transfers accurately, completely, generation after generation without degradation is not a machine. It is a school. And schools, like governments and religions, have their own spectacular ways of failing. And even if the population numbers stay right, who guarantees that the children born into those numbers will know how to do everything the ship needs them to do to stay alive? In 2023, a team of researchers at the University of California, Berkeley published a paper in the journal American Mineralogist that solved a puzzle more than 1,500 years old. Roman concrete opus caementicium had been sitting in plain sight for centuries, the Pantheon still standing after nearly 2,000 years. Harbor structures along the Italian coastline still largely intact after being submerged in seawater for millennia. While modern reinforced concrete crumbles in decades, engineers and archaeologists had known for a long time that Roman concrete was superior. What they did not know, until that 2023 publication, was exactly why. The answer turned out to involve a specific chemical reaction between seawater, volcanic ash, and a particular mineral called aluminous tobermorite. a reaction that Roman builders had stumbled into empirically and refined over generations of practice, but never wrote down as a replicable formula in terms that survived the fall of their civilization. The knowledge existed. It was practiced. It produced some of the most durable construction material in human history. And then it was lost completely, irrecoverably, for over 1,500 years, simply because the network of people who held it in living practice was disrupted and never reconstituted. On Earth, that loss was an inconvenience, a fascinating historical puzzle, a missed opportunity for better construction materials across 15 centuries. The world continued. Other methods were developed. Civilizations rose and fell and rose again using inferior concrete. And nobody died specifically because Roman concrete knowledge had been forgotten. The redundancy of planetary-scale civilization absorbed the loss without catastrophic consequence. On a generation ship, there is no such redundancy. When knowledge disappears on the ship, it is gone from the only repository that matters. There is no other library, no parallel civilization, no academic institution on another continent that preserved a copy. The ship carries everything it will ever know, and the ship's knowledge does not live in databases alone. It lives primarily in the trained minds and practiced hands of the people operating the systems. When those people die without fully transmitting what they know to the next generation, the ship becomes a little more fragile. When that happens repeatedly, across 20 generations and 500 years, the accumulated degradation can reach critical systems at critical moments. The scope of what must be preserved and transmitted is genuinely staggering. Operating a functional interstellar vessel requires deep working knowledge across mechanical engineering, electrical and electronic systems, nuclear or advanced propulsion physics, atmospheric chemistry and life support management, hydroponic and closed-loop agricultural science, medicine and pharmacology, materials science, computer systems and software maintenance, structural engineering, and the dozens of specialized subdisciplines within each of those fields. Not survey-level familiarity. The kind of knowledge that lets a person diagnose an unfamiliar failure mode at 3 in the morning and make the right call before something irreversible happens. The kind of knowledge that only comes from years of hands-on practice under experienced supervision, which means every generation must produce enough trained specialists across every critical domain to staff the ship's functions and train the generation that follows. Estimates from researchers working on generation ship educational requirements suggest this demands a commitment of resources and institutional structure roughly equivalent to running dozens of graduate programs simultaneously, continuously, for 500 years, with mandatory enrollment and no opt-out provision, which immediately produces a contradiction that has no clean resolution. If every person on the ship is required to devote significant years of their education and working life to mastering survival, critical technical disciplines, who makes the art? Who writes the music? Who does the philosophy, the literature, the cultural work that gives the technical labor meaning and keeps the civilization recognizably human rather than purely functional? This is not a soft question about personal fulfillment. It is a hard question about what kind of entity arrives at the destination after 500 years. A population that has optimized entirely for technical survival, that has educated every generation purely in the disciplines required to keep the ship running, may arrive genetically intact and mechanically competent, but culturally hollowed. The arts and humanities are not decoration on a civilization. They are the mechanism by which human communities process suffering, transmit values, negotiate identity, and maintain the psychological coherence that distinguishes a society from a population. Strip them away in the name of technical efficiency, and you may find, several generations in, that the technically competent people you have produced no longer share enough common meaning to function as a coherent community which is itself a threat to mission survival. But the deeper danger is not the curriculum question. It is what happens to technical knowledge specifically as it passes from mind to mind across 20 generations of imperfect human transmission. Every educator simplifies. Every student retains imperfectly. Every generation inherits a slightly compressed, slightly rounded version of what the previous generation actually knew, with the edges of deep understanding smoothed away and the tacit knowledge the stuff that lives in practiced intuition, rather than written procedures, gradually replaced by procedural habit that works until it suddenly does not. The classic illustration of cumulative transmission error is the telephone game A Sentence Whispered from Person to Person down a chain of 20, arriving at the end transformed beyond recognition by the accumulation of small mishearings and small substitutions. Now, replace the sentence with the operational procedures for managing a nuclear reactor core under abnormal load conditions. Pass it through 20 human generations, each doing their imperfect best to understand and transmit it accurately, each adapting it slightly to the technical vocabulary and conceptual frameworks of their own time, each inevitably losing some fraction of the original depth. After 500 years and 20 transmissions, what arrives at the far end of that chain may be procedurally recognizable. The steps may still be followed in the correct sequence, while the underlying understanding of why each step matters, what physical process it controls, and how to reason about novel failures that the procedure does not explicitly address has quietly evaporated. The operators follow the checklist. The checklist was designed for anticipated failure modes. The unanticipated failure mode, the one that requires genuine understanding to diagnose, kills them. NASA's own long-range planning documents for deep space missions have grappled with exactly this problem. And the proposed solution, seriously debated in aerospace engineering circles, is to use artificial intelligence systems as knowledge custodians, AI, that holds the complete technical documentation for every ship system, can be queried by crew members across generations, and theoretically preserves the original depth of understanding that human transmission would degrade. The solution to the 500-year knowledge preservation problem, in other words, is software. Everyone can see the issue. Software requires maintenance. Software runs on hardware. Hardware degrades. The AI knowledge custodian is itself a system that needs to be understood and maintained by the people it is supposed to be teaching, which reintroduces the exact problem it was designed to solve, one level of abstraction higher. If you had to choose 3 fields of mandatory study for every person on the ship, what would you pick? Think carefully, because whatever you choose, something else gets deprioritized, and whatever gets deprioritized for 500 years may not exist on the ship anymore when it finally arrives. The destination does not receive the civilization that launched. It receives whatever that civilization became, or whatever remained of it, after 5 centuries of imperfect transmission, accumulated compromise, and the slow pressure of an environment that demanded constant technical competence while providing almost no space for anything else. Knowledge can be guarded, systems can be backed up, curricula can be mandated, but none of that touches the thing that no amount of careful planning has ever reliably prevented across the whole of human history. But even if knowledge is perfectly preserved, no system has ever defended against pure probability. And over 500 years, probability will find the ship. The calculation is straightforward, and it does not care about optimism. If the probability of a ship-level catastrophe, a disease outbreak severe enough to kill a significant fraction of the population, a core systems failure, a social breakdown crossing into open violent conflict is just 0.5% per decade, then over 500 years. The probability that at least one such event occurs is not low. It is not manageable. It is 91.4%. Round up and call it near certain. That 0.5% per decade assumption is, if anything, generous. It assumes a level of systemic reliability and social stability that no human institution in history has maintained for comparable durations. The math does not require pessimism to produce a terrifying answer. It only requires honesty about what half a millennium actually means in probability terms. This is not a designed-in flaw that better engineering could eliminate. It is a direct consequence of timescale. Rare events become near inevitable over long enough periods. A 1 in 1,000-year flood happens roughly once per millennium, which means that over 500 years, you have about a 40% chance of experiencing one. The longer the mission, the more the probability space fills with events that in any single decade would seem vanishingly unlikely. 500 years is an enormous amount of time for bad things to find you. The historical record on disease in enclosed communities is particularly instructive and particularly grim. The Black Death, which swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, killed between 30 and 60% of the European population and Europe in the 14th century, was not a closed system. People could flee. Infected regions could be partially quarantined from others. Rural areas with lower population density experienced lower mortality than cities. The geography of the continent provided natural buffers that slowed transmission and allowed some communities to escape the worst. Even with all that natural variation and geographic separation, the mortality was catastrophic. Now consider a pathogen introduced into a generation ship, a mutation of an existing organism, or something novel arising from the particular microbiological conditions of a closed environment after generations of coevolution with its human hosts. There is no rural countryside to retreat to, no lower density region offering reduced exposure. Every person on the ship breathes the same recycled air, drinks from the same water system, eats food grown in the same agricultural bays. A sufficiently virulent pathogen on a generation ship has nowhere to burn out. It has direct, continuous access to the entire population. Space itself has already demonstrated what fire means in an enclosed, pressurized environment. In February of 1997, a fire broke out aboard the Russian space station Mir during a routine oxygen candle burn. The fire burned for approximately 14 minutes, which sounds brief, until you understand that on a space station, 14 minutes of fire produces enough toxic smoke to make the atmosphere dangerous, and that fire in microgravity does not behave like fire on Earth. Flames spread in 3 dimensions without the convective column that makes terrestrial fire predictable. The crew of 6, which included American astronauts as part of a joint mission, had several minutes in which the correct course of action was genuinely unclear. Evacuate to the Soyuz capsule, or attempt to fight the fire and risk being separated from the escape vehicle by smoke. They fought the fire. It went out. Everyone survived. The Soyuz was there, on a generation ship. There is no Soyuz. There is no escape capsule that can take everyone somewhere safe. Fire, flood from a ruptured system, toxic atmospheric contamination from an agricultural or chemical accident. Any of these events forces the entire population to respond, contain, and recover, using only what is on the ship, with no backup option and no safe harbor. The scenario that systems theorists call the domino cascade is the one that keeps mission planners awake. It goes like this. A disease outbreak, not necessarily a civilization-ending plague. Just a severe epidemic kills 30% of the population over the course of 18 months. 30% sounds survivable. The civilization continues. But 30% of the population includes 30% of the engineering specialists, 30% of the agricultural technicians, 30% of the medical staff. The surviving 70% now has to maintain systems designed for a full workforce, while also caring for the sick and managing the psychological aftermath of mass death. Maintenance schedules slip. A secondary system failure occurs less critical, but now there are fewer people to address it. The repair is botched under pressure. a tertiary failure follows. Food production dips below requirements for the population's caloric needs. Rationing begins. Rationing produces social conflict. Social conflict produces factional violence, or at minimum, the kind of institutional breakdown that makes coordinated technical response harder. The technical response gets worse precisely when it needs to be better. The cascade accelerates. This is not a science fiction scenario. This is systems analysis applied to a closed environment with finite redundancy. And the dynamics it describes are consistent with how closed system collapses have actually unfolded in the historical record. From isolated island communities, to besieged cities, to failed polar expeditions. On Earth, civilizational collapse is survivable at the species level because the species is distributed. The Black Death killed perhaps 30 to 50% of Eurasia's population and still left hundreds of millions of people alive across the planet in different climatic zones, speaking different languages, operating different agricultural systems, carrying different knowledge bases. When one node of civilization fails catastrophically, others persist and eventually reconnect. The redundancy is planetary and structural. A generation ship has no such redundancy. It is one node, one vessel. Every person who has ever lived on it, every piece of knowledge it carries, every genetic lineage it represents, all of it, concentrated in a single point of failure, moving through a void where no help can reach it for centuries in either direction. A small truck carrying all of humanity's eggs. One accident. That's everything. Mission planning documents produced by serious researchers, not science fiction writers. Actual aerospace engineers and social scientists working on long-duration mission viability have proposed that a generation ship would require what they call a comprehensive civilization audit. Every decade, a systematic review of population health, genetic diversity metrics, knowledge base completeness, infrastructure integrity, social cohesion indicators, and resource projections. A full-spectrum institutional health check, repeated every 10 years for 500 years, to catch the early signs of any of the cascades described above before they become irreversible. This is, in practical terms, an audit of an entire society, performed 50 times, by the society being audited on itself, with no external validator. What do you think is most likely to end the mission? A technical failure, a disease outbreak, or a revolt? None of those answers is wrong. History offers precedents for all three ending isolated communities permanently. The honest answer is probably whichever one the designers least expected, the failure mode that fell outside the scenario planning. The event that seemed too unlikely to design against. The cascade that started from a direction nobody was watching. That is how closed systems tend to die, not from the threats that were anticipated and defended against, but from the second-order consequences of something that seemed, at first, survivable. Assume everything survives. The ship arrives. The population is intact. The knowledge is preserved. That is exactly when the most terrifying part actually begins. The generations that lived and died on the ship adapted completely to its artificial environment, not as a choice as biology. The human body is not a fixed object. It is a system in constant dialogue with its surroundings, reshaping itself across years and decades in response to the forces and conditions it experiences. Bone density responds to mechanical load. The cardiovascular system calibrates to the demands placed on it. The vestibular system, the inner ear apparatus governing balance and spatial orientation, tunes itself to the gravitational and motion environment it consistently encounters. After 500 years of life under artificial gravity, generated by rotation or other mechanical means, in filtered air at controlled pressure, under LED lighting, cycling through programmed day-night patterns, the bodies of the people who finally reach the destination will be the products of 500 years of adaptation to a machine, not to a planet. The medical data from the International Space Station offers the closest available preview, and it is not encouraging. Astronauts who spend 6 months aboard the ISS, not 500 years, 6 months return to Earth, requiring extensive physical rehabilitation before they can walk normally. Bone density loss runs at approximately 1 to 2% per month in microgravity, even with 2 hours of daily mandatory exercise. Muscle mass deteriorates. The cardiovascular system, no longer needing to pump blood against full gravity, restructures itself in ways that cause significant orthostatic intolerance. When gravity is reintroduced, the inability to maintain blood pressure when standing, producing dizziness, weakness, and in some cases, fainting. Vision problems have been documented in a majority of long-duration ISS crew members, caused by fluid shifts toward the head in microgravity, altering intracranial pressure and distorting the optic nerve. After 6 months, with daily exercise, protocols specifically designed to slow the deterioration, with immediate medical support upon return, with a planet-adapted body to begin with. The generation that steps off a generation ship assuming the artificial gravity system was never perfect, was at some point repaired or modified, varied across different sections of the vessel, will not have planet-adapted bodies to begin with. They will have ship-adapted bodies, bodies shaped by the specific gravitational, atmospheric, and sensory conditions of the vessel across their entire developmental history, from infancy through adulthood. For the generations born on the ship, the planet is the alien environment. The ship is home. Every physiological system they possess has been calibrated to something that does not exist on the surface of any natural world. But the physical adaptation problem, as serious as it is, may be secondary to what waits in the microbiology of a new planet. The human immune system is not a static defense. It is a learned one. It develops its capabilities through exposure, cataloging encountered pathogens and environmental microorganisms across a lifetime, building a library of responses that grows with experience. Children raised in environments with high microbial diversity develop more robust immune systems than those raised in sterile conditions. After 500 years in a controlled, filtered, intensively managed, closed environment where every microorganism present was either deliberately introduced or has co-evolved with the human population through centuries of mutual adaptation, the immune systems of the arriving generation will have an extremely narrow experiential library. They will be, in immunological terms, profoundly naive to the microbial world of a natural planet. History has already run this experiment in reverse, and the results were catastrophic. When European colonizers arrived in the Americas beginning in the late 15th century, the indigenous populations they encountered had been biologically isolated from Eurasian disease pools for thousands of years. Smallpox, measles, influenza, common diseases in Europe, against which most Europeans had acquired significant immunity through generations of exposure, moved through indigenous American populations, with mortality rates estimated between 50 and 90% in some communities. Not because the diseases were uniquely virulent, because the immune systems encountering them had no prior experience to draw on. The colonizers were the reservoir, the indigenous populations were the immunologically naive ones. On a generation ship, arriving at a biologically active planet, the relationship inverts completely. The arriving humans are the immunologically naive party. The planet's microbial ecosystem, billions of years of evolution producing organisms no human immune system has ever encountered, is the reservoir. The ship's population steps off into a world where every breath, every surface contact, every sip of unprocessed water represents an immunological unknown. And this assumes the planet is biologically active at all. If the destination is closer to Mars geologically alive, atmospherically thin, cold, and as of current knowledge apparently lifeless, the physical challenges shift, but do not disappear. A planet that cannot support human life without modification requires terraforming the deliberate, large-scale alteration of a planet's atmosphere, temperature, and surface chemistry to make it habitable. The theoretical timescales for terraforming, even a relatively cooperative candidate like Mars, run from several hundred to several thousand years, using technologies that do not yet exist in operational form. The most optimistic proposals involving deliberate greenhouse gas release, orbital mirrors to increase solar input, biological seeding with engineered organisms compress the timeline to perhaps 300 years under ideal conditions with sufficiently advanced technology. The realistic projections extend considerably further. 500 years to arrive, potentially 1,000 more years before the surface is genuinely habitable without life support infrastructure. The generation that completes the voyage that experiences the moment every generation before them died working toward looks out the observation port and sees a rust-colored dead world, or a world teeming with alien biology that their bodies cannot safely engage with, and understands that they are not the destination. They are the next beginning. The baton passes again to another set of people who will spend their lives working towards something they will not live to see. Completed. After 500 years on the ship, the arriving generation looks out the window at a barren red world and realizes they need another 1,000 years before it becomes somewhere anyone can actually live. No mission briefing covers what that does to a person psychologically. If you were the generation that finally arrived and discovered the planet was not yet livable, what would you do next? Because that moment, the arrival that is not an arrival, the destination that is not a destination, is the psychological event that no mission planner has adequately addressed. Every generation on the ship was sustained by the meaning of the journey, by the story that suffering had a purpose and the purpose had an endpoint. The arriving generation discovers that the endpoint was not an endpoint, it was a waypoint, and the question of whether a civilization that has already spent 500 years in transit can psychologically absorb. That revelation can reorient around another centuries-long project without fracturing under the weight of deferred expectation is genuinely open. The technical challenges of arrival may be easier than the human ones. And here is what nobody wants to say directly the entire 500-year journey. All of that sacrifice may have been the wrong choice from the beginning, or more precisely, may not have been a choice at all. The founding generation of a generation ship makes a decision on behalf of approximately 20 generations of people who do not yet exist. They choose the destination, determine the mission parameters, establish the governance structures, set the educational requirements, design the reproductive management systems, and commit the entire social and biological trajectory of their descendants' people who will live, suffer, and die inside a metal vessel crossing interstellar space without being able to ask any of those people whether they consent to the arrangement. They cannot ask. The people whose lives are being determined are not born yet. They do not exist at the moment the decision is made. And by the time they do exist, the decision is not merely made. It is physically irreversible. The ship is already moving. The destination is already set. The option to decline has already closed. This is not a new philosophical problem. It is, in fact, one of the oldest. Every generation makes decisions that bind its successors, infrastructure built, debts incurred, environmental damage done, political structures created without the consent of the people who will inherit the consequences. Parents choose their children's country, language, religion, and social class before those children have any capacity for preference. Civilizations consume resources that future generations will not have. The problem of intergenerational ethics runs through every domain of human decision-making, but the generation ship concentrates it to an extreme that strips away all the ambiguity about degree and leaves only the raw principle: can a living generation impose a 500-year sentence of confinement, danger, and hard labor on people not yet born? with no possibility of parole. For the purpose of an outcome, those unborn people cannot evaluate or endorse. Philosophers working in the field of intergenerational ethics have a term for the central challenge, the non-identity problem, articulated most influentially by British philosopher Derek Parfit. The people who will live on the generation ship do not exist before the decision to launch it. If the ship is not built, those specific people are never born. Different people are born instead, living different lives. In a strict philosophical sense, the ship's future inhabitants cannot be harmed by the decision to send them on the voyage, because without that decision, they would never have existed to be harmed. The alternative for them is not a better life somewhere else. The alternative is non-existence. This argument, taken to its logical conclusion, suggests that creating people to live in difficult conditions is not a violation of their interests, because the only alternative is that they have no interests at all. The counter-argument comes from several directions, most pointedly from philosophers like David Benatar at the University of Cape Town, whose work on the ethics of procreation argues that bringing people into existence in conditions of guaranteed suffering is itself a moral harm, that the absence of a person involves no deprivation, while existence in a constrained and painful environment involves real suffering, and that creating suffering is not ethically neutralized simply because the alternative is non-existence. Benatar's position, applied to generation ships, is uncompromising. Deliberately creating human beings to spend their entire lives confined in a metal vessel, unable to leave, unable to choose, serving a mission they never endorsed, constitutes a profound ethical violation, regardless of the nobility of the purpose. The fact that humanity's long-term survival may depend on it does not dissolve the wrong. It only creates a tragic collision between two legitimate moral demands that cannot both be fully satisfied. The utilitarian case for the ship is straightforward and not easily dismissed. The sun will expand into a red giant in approximately 5 billion years, rendering Earth uninhabitable. That is a long time away, long enough that most people's intuitions about risk do not engage with it meaningfully. But there are nearer threats: asteroid impact, supervolcanic eruption, engineered pandemic, nuclear exchange, any of dozens of civilization-ending scenarios that actuarial analysis assigns non-trivial probability across the coming millennia. A species confined to a single planet is, in the long run, a species with an extinction date. Interstellar expansion, however brutal the mechanism, is the only strategy that converts humanity from a temporary local phenomenon into something with genuine cosmic permanence. From this perspective, the sacrifice of several generations to secure the survival of all future generations is not merely acceptable. It is the most morally serious thing a civilization could undertake. The math, if you accept the utilitarian framework, strongly favors the ship. What makes this problem genuinely irreducible is that science cannot adjudicate it. Trajectory calculations, population genetics, atmospheric chemistry, propulsion physics, all of those questions have answers that scientific method can approach. The question of whether one generation has the moral authority to determine the lives of 20 unborn generations is not that kind of question. It sits in the territory where empirical investigation has nothing to contribute, where the answer depends entirely on which ethical framework you apply, and where serious, careful, intellectually honest philosophers have been arriving at opposite conclusions for decades without either side finding a decisive argument. Think of parents who decide to immigrate to a new country, uprooting their 5-year-old child without asking the child's opinion. The child does not consent. The child may resent it for years, but the child grows up, and if things work out, can eventually make their own choices, including the choice to return, or to move somewhere else entirely, or to make peace with the decision their parents made. The irreversibility is partial. The constraint is temporary. The child's future remains open. Now multiply that by 500 years. Remove every possibility of return. Remove every possibility of exit. Remove the part where the child's future opens up into genuine freedom. The immigration analogy carries the emotional shape of the generation ship problem, but at a scale that transforms it into something qualitatively different. At least in immigration, when the child grows up, they can buy a plane ticket home. On a generation ship, going back is simply not on the menu. Do you believe humanity has the right to make that decision? Or is it the greatest ethical violation we can imagine? There is no correct answer written anywhere, not in any scientific paper, not in any philosophical text, not in any religious tradition. The question sits open, unresolved, at the center of the most consequential decision our species may ever face. And while you are sitting with it, while you are turning it over, feeling its weight, trying to find a position that holds the there is one final truth about generation ships that almost nobody mentions. A truth that reframes everything you have just heard. Not a footnote, not a qualification, a revelation that changes what this entire conversation was actually about. And while you wrestle with that question, there is one final truth about generation ships that almost no one talks about. A truth that changes the meaning of everything you have just heard. Everything described in this story, the isolation with no exit, the inherited mission that no one alive today consented to join, the destination whose true nature remains unknown, the closed system of finite resources being stretched by a growing population, the governance structures built by people long dead that still determine the lives of the living, the psychological pressure of an environment no one chose, the knowledge systems degrading through imperfect transmission across generations, the existential weight of continuing a journey whose endpoint is uncertain describes, with complete precision, the current situation of every human being alive on Earth right now. This is not metaphor, it is literal. The Earth is moving. It has always been moving. The solar system travels around the center of the Milky Way at approximately 220 kilometers per second. Our planet is not stationary. It is a vessel in motion, carrying its entire population through space at a speed that makes every rocket humanity has ever built look stationary by comparison. The resources aboard are finite, a fixed inventory of minerals, water, atmosphere, and biological productivity that does not get replenished from outside. The ecosystem is under strain from the demands of a population that has grown from roughly 1 billion in the year 1800 to over 8 billion today, and is projected to peak somewhere between 9 and 11 billion before the end of this century. No resupply mission is coming. No external authority governs the vessel. The people alive today did not consent to be born into this situation. They arrived into it, inherited it from generations who made decisions without asking them, and are now responsible for decisions that will bind generations who cannot yet be asked. If that sounds familiar, it should. The generation ship problem is not a future engineering challenge. It is a present condition. The ship already launched. It launched approximately 4.5 billion years ago, when the Earth formed from the collapse of a solar nebula, and every human being who has ever lived has been a passenger on it, born into the voyage, unable to leave, inheriting the consequences of every previous generation's choices, making choices that the next generation will inherit in turn. But the cognitive inversion runs deeper still, and the final layer is the one that should genuinely stop you. If humanity succeeds, if the engineering problems get solved, if the social challenges get managed, if generation ships are actually built and actually launched and actually arrive, then the descendants of those ships, after enough time, could spread across the Milky Way, not quickly, not in any single lifetime or any single century, but over millions of years, a time span that is itself almost incomprehensible, but that is genuinely available. Given the age of the galaxy and the timescales of stellar evolution, the descendant civilizations of Earth could distribute themselves across hundreds of thousands of star systems. And from that future vantage point, looking back across the full arc of what humanity became, the entirety of human civilization as it exists right now, every city, every nation, every scientific achievement, every war, every work of art, every generation that has ever lived on Earth would be the founding generation, the first compartment, the people who launched, the ones who did not live to see the destination, but whose existence made everything that followed possible. We are not building the generation ship. We are the generation ship's origin story. Everything happening on Earth right now is what the first chapter looks like. And this is where the story opens into its final, largest question, the one that the Fermi paradox has been asking since physicist Enrico Fermi reportedly posed it at a lunch in 1950. If the universe is billions of years old and contains hundreds of billions of stars, and many of those stars have planets, and some of those planets presumably developed intelligent life long before Earth did, where is everyone? Why has no civilization, in all that time and all that space, made itself detectable to us? Why is the night sky silent? One class of answer, the one that fits most uncomfortably against everything considered in this story, is not that interstellar civilizations are impossible. It is that they are possible, and that civilizations capable of building them consistently choose not to, or attempt them and fail in the ways this story has described, or look honestly at the cost the generations condemned to transit, the lives spent serving a mission they did not choose, the suffering distributed across centuries in the name of species survival, and decide, with full information and clear eyes, that the price is too high, that a civilization contained on one world, living fully within its own time and its own place, is not a failure of ambition. It might be a moral conclusion. Every point of light in the night sky is a star. Most of those stars have planets. On some of those planets, there may be or may have been beings capable of asking this exact question. Beings who looked up at the same dark canvas and felt the same vertigo of distance, the same hunger to know what lives in the light of other suns. And perhaps some of them worked the numbers. Perhaps some of them designed the ships. Perhaps some of them asked the questions this story has been asking about governance across centuries, about the ethics of binding the unborn, about the psychological cost of permanent confinement, about who gives up their life so that the species might continue. And perhaps, after working all of it through with honesty and rigor, they arrived at an answer, their own answer, an answer we cannot hear from here. Maybe they built the ships anyway. Maybe they chose not to. Maybe they tried and the cascade failures ended them. Somewhere in the dark between stars, with no record and no rescue, the silence of the universe does not tell us which. It only tells us that, whatever choice they made, we cannot see the result from here. Generation ships are humanity's largest unanswered question. Not can we build one that is an engineering problem. And engineering problems eventually yield to time and resources and ingenuity. The unanswered question is deeper. It is, should we? Should one generation purchase the species' cosmic survival by condemning 20 generations to a voyage they never chose? Should the living bind the unborn to a mission whose cost is a human lifetime and whose benefit arrives centuries after everyone who paid the cost is gone? Should humanity reach for the stars at this price, or find another way, or accept the boundaries of a single world and make the most of the one vessel it already has? Science can calculate the trajectory. It cannot answer the question. The answer you give the framework you bring to it, the weight you assign to survival against the weight you assign to the lives of the people doing the surviving, will say something precise and irreducible about what you believe a human life is worth, what obligations the living carry toward the unborn, and what kind of species humanity actually is when the comfortable ambiguity is stripped away and the real choice appears. Look up at the night sky. Every point of light is a destination. Every destination carries this cost, and somewhere in the dark between those points of light, the question is waiting patient, indifferent, without any deadline for the answer that only you can give. Generation ships are not the question of whether we can go. They are the question of who we are willing to become in order to get there. And that answer, your answer, defines what humanity is.